Hello. So in this video, I'm going to talk through how to tackle A-level history comparison essay questions. Um, in my time as a teacher and also just looking at the comments that I get on some of the YouTube videos, it's clear that students find these comparison essay questions trickier than the regular essay questions. And I agree, I think they are trickier. So I thought it would be useful to put a video together just giving some kind of guidance on how to approach comparison essay questions. This relates mainly to edXL A-level history, but if you do have comparison questions in other exam boards, then hopefully it'll be useful as well in terms of just giving you some ideas on how to structure these questions. So, in terms of how the structure of the video is going to work, I'm going to talk through what comparison questions are, and then I'm going to go through the two different types. So, time period comparison questions and factors comparison questions, and then just give some final thoughts. So, firstly, what are comparison questions? So, I've just kind of given the answer in the last slide, but there's two types. The first type is where you've got questions asking you to compare the similarities and differences between two time periods. And as I said, very shortly, I'm going to go through quite a lot of examples for people to see. The second type of comparison question is where the question is asking you to compare two factors. Now, the issue here is that if you've seen my other videos on essay planning and structure, I suggest 3 paragraphs for A-level history essays. So it gives students this kind of issue of, well, how can I make 3 paragraphs if it's only asking me about 2 things? So I've got some ideas and I'm going to talk through it, and hopefully it'll be useful for students just to see some examples and some approaches. So the first type of question, comparison question, is the comparison of time periods. So here are 4 examples, and I've tried to give examples from different topics and from different options. So the first one is the question from Stuart Britton: to what extent was Republican rule different from the personal rule of Charles I? Then we've got a Russian question: how accurate is it to say that the nature of government under Lenin and Stalin was markedly different? Then we've got a Germany question: how far do you agree that the economic policies of the Nazi regime were remarkably similar to those of the FRG? And then we've got a America question: how far do you agree that there was a considerable similarity between the campaigns for black civil rights and minority civil rights? So here we've got 4 examples of questions that are asking you to compare time periods, essentially. And as you can see, David Lloyd George in the top right hand corner giving some useful guidance. What we've got to do is to aim for 3 themes and compare within each. Okay, so if it's a time period question, it would not be a good idea to do paragraph 1 on the first time period and paragraph 2 on the second time period, because you're not doing enough comparison. A better approach is to think of 3 themes. I mean, if you can only think of 2 themes, that's okay, but think of themes that you then compare within the paragraph. So here's an example approach, or a suggested structure, I should say. So obviously, intro and conclusions, we're not talking about them in this video. You can look at my other videos on that. But the main body of the essay will be themes that then you compare the 2 time periods. So at the bottom of the slide, you can see I've got some ideas for themes. It could be a social, political, economic theme. You might have a theme on leadership, a paragraph on leadership, perhaps popularity of government or internal threats or specific areas of policy like religion, agriculture, finance, etc. And I've got on the right hand side an example of from a civil rights paper of a question that I just kind of came up with, asking you to compare 2 time periods in which you would think about social, political, and economic rights, and then compare the 2 time periods within each paragraph. So hopefully that kind of clarifies an approach for students. If you get a question that comes up, it's asking you to compare 2 time periods. My suggestion, my advice is to think of themes, ideally 3, that then you compare the 2 different time periods. Okay, so if any of this isn't clear, please leave a comment and I'll try my best to explain it further. The second type of comparison questions are the factors questions, where you've got two factors to compare. Now, these are not as common, and I did have to look through lots and lots of past papers to try and find examples, but obviously I have seen some, and they are trickier, I think, than the... In some ways, they are trickier, but you don't have to think of themes. So here are the comparison of factor question examples. So here's one from kind of the Norman Conquest. It was King Harold's mistakes rather than Duke William's skills that were responsible for the Norman victory at Hastings in October 1066. How far do you agree with this statement? So you can see we've got two factors there: King Harold's mistakes and Duke William's skills. It's not asking you about anything else. It's not asking you about any other reasons for the Norman victory. It's just asking you to compare those two things. The second example is from a Germany paper, and it says, how far do you agree that economic factors were more responsible than political factors in the outbreak of revolution in the German state in 1848? So again, it's only asking you about economic factors versus political factors. And as we've got some advice here from Frederick Douglass, who says you only need to discuss the two factors in question. So you don't need to bring something else in. And I must admit, when I first saw these type of questions as a teacher, I used to say, oh, you can bring another factor in and make sure you link it back to the ones that are there. But in more recent times, when I've been studying and looking at examiners' reports in more detail, there's actually guidance in there that says you don't need to bring other things in. And there's one exemplar that actually praises the comments on the exemplar, praise the level 5 answer, the top level answer, for not bringing other things in and focusing solely on the two that are in the question. So in terms of some approaches, and I'll go on to the approaches slide in a second, but you could obviously just do paragraph 1 on one factor, paragraph 2 on another factor, or you could break them down, 2 paragraphs on one, 2 paragraphs on the second. Or you could perhaps do 2 paragraphs on one and 1 paragraph on the other, as long as it wasn't completely unbalanced. So the most obvious approach, I think, would be to do this, where you have 2 bigger paragraphs, where instead of maybe 3 pieces of evidence, maybe you're looking at kind of 4 or 5 pieces of evidence, something like that. But your conclusion becomes very, very, very important in this essay, because you're really, really using your conclusion to weigh them up. So it's not just a simple kind of, answer with a justification. You really do have to spend a lot of time weighing up the which factor is most important and why. Obviously, that you could weave that into the paragraphs as well. As I say, some alternatives, you could do 2 paragraphs on each factor. Or you could split it up into time period, potentially do early, middle, late, particularly if it's a breadth question and you need that coverage. You could split up the time period in question into kind of the early period, the middle, the late, and then compare the factors within each of those time periods. So that's another option if it is perhaps a breadth question and there's more to say there. So I hope that's been helpful on comparison questions. These are trickier questions for sure, particularly compared to your regular kind of factors questions. So here are some final kind of thoughts on this. Firstly, it's useful to think of themes when comparing time periods. So as you're revising, as you're going over your notes for the topics, identify key themes for each kind of time period of the course. That'll be helpful if you do get a question comparing time periods. If you do get a question comparing factors, you just write about the 2 factors in question. It's worth preparing for these, thinking about how you can approach these and which factors might kind of come up. But you've got to remember in your analysis to consistently compare, weigh them up against each other using sentence starters, unlike economic reasons, political reasons did this, or in the same way as economic reasons, political reasons did this. Those kind of things, bouncing them off each other. Perhaps these keywords might be helpful as well. This was a symbolic difference, or it was a fundamental difference. They were narrow similarities or widespread. This factor was more widespread than the other, etc. So think about those kind of words to develop your analysis when you're doing these comparison questions. I hope that was helpful. If you have got any comments, please leave them below, and I'll try my best to answer them. And I hope it was useful. Thank you for listening.